Okay, here we are, everybody, ready for our third lecture. This is where really American history comes into its own, because prior to this time, we've talked about the pre-Columbian period in North America, where Europeans are totally absent. It's just Native Americans. Then we had this Columbian exchange, and then the colonial process, and there's all these different powers: the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English. And then eventually the English will come to dominate. We talked a little bit about the Russians too. Eventually the English will come to dominate pretty much all of North America. And that will come in the late colonial period and then through the Revolutionary period. So this will cover chapters 5 and 6. And here we are, Hamilton fans, you are going to love this. So the beginning of the end, really, of British control over North America is going to be the French and Indian War. So I think I had mentioned to you before, it's rather telling that Spain was able to hold on to its colonies for about 300 years, England/Britain only about half that time, only about 160 years or so, 1607 from Jamestown, the first one being founded, until 1776. Now, salutary neglect is a big part of that. Part of it is the Enlightenment and the ideas that were allowed to spread. Part of it is the French and Indian War, as it's known in America. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. It's just two different names for the same concept, essentially. Why the two different names? Well, already there should be alarm bells going off in the mind of King George II, and then after him, the third. And here's why. Because this war does not originate in Europe. We looked briefly at King William's War, Queen Anne's War. These were wars in the last set of lecture notes in the early 1700s, where wars will originate in Europe. So, for instance, King William's War is really the Glorious Revolution. James is deposed, William and Mary come to power, and then all of Europe goes to war over which of those two competing factions will control the British crown. Because if James wins with his Catholic allies of Spain and France, they're going to be more powerful with an ally in James. If, on the other hand, William and Mary win, then guess what? Then Holland and other countries in Northern Europe, the Prussian states, for instance, the Protestant areas of Europe, will be more powerful. So what happens is wars will spring out of Europe, and then they will mainline to the colonies, with colonial peoples backing up the mother country that they represent, right? So war breaks out in Europe. British colonists say, we're going to march into the West and the North to raid these, French villages in Quebec, or we're going to march into Florida to, try to bother the Spanish down there. This one is the other way around. This war originates in America, and then it mainlines back to Europe. That should have been very telling to anyone in Europe, but especially King George II, that colonists had their own foreign policy now. We were getting the mother country into a war against the wishes of her king. So it basically happens because in what's called the back country, the area west of the Appalachian Mountains, in the area of today, for instance, what's called Ohio, that was claimed both by British colonists and by French colonists and their Native American allies. So essentially you have 2 million people living in British North America on the eastern coast of what's today the US. You have the French and their Native American allies in the French Crescent, and kind of the merging together of these two great empires with no clear mandate for who's going to control the area. The war really begins through a series of small skirmishes, small little remote outposts there. The French and their Native American allies will start attacking British settlers that have come west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British then will call upon their militia units to go, and there's these small little skirmishes. They're not even battles, but this sort of triggers the all-out reinforcements of both sides to go in and start competing over that territory. In fact, our great hero, George Washington, he gets his start in his military start in this war and it's not a very glorious one. In fact, Washington surrenders without shots even being fired at Fort Necessity in the west of Pennsylvania. And what's today Pittsburgh is what it's called. Pittsburgh, initially named after the prime minister of the time, William Pitt. And Washington was humiliated in this initial starting of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. It's called the 7 Years' War because it starts later in Europe. It's 1757 to 1763. It makes no sense to call it the 7 Years' War in America because it lasted 9 years, hence the other name. So we don't need to really get into all the ins and outs of it. You need to know, in terms of military history, that's never big on the AP test. All you need to know is that the French and their Native American allies did very well in the first 3 years of the war, 1754, 55, 56. They are routing the English, driving them east of the Appalachian Mountains rather easily. And this should be embarrassing, not to play into stereotypes here, but do you guys think the French are known for their military prowess? Not really, right? They're often made fun because they surrendered so easily in just 4 weeks in World War II, despite the fact that they fought very valiantly in many, many other wars throughout history. That's all they're really remembered for militarily. And it was very humiliating. Everybody thought France was going to run away with this. The tide is turned in 1757. Reinforcements go to America. Britain sends its fleet all over the world. And when the dust settles in 1763, Britain has become overwhelmingly victorious in a way that nobody just thought possible at the time. The victory is so complete that France is forever humiliated by this war. This is the war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, that brings about what most people in history today called the Pax Britannica, the British peace, from 1767 to 1945 until the end of World War II. Britain basically ran the world. They had the largest empire. The world economy was based on the British pound sterling, their currency. That was the reserve currency of the world. Their insurance company, Lloyd's of London, insured international shipping. Their navy patrolled the world's oceans to protect against piracy. And they controlled more vital strategic areas of the globe than anyone else. It is this war where they will walk away with all of India. A lot of people don't know this, that India actually had 5 or 6 different competing colonial interests, all trying to take over them. The first to arrive in India are the Portuguese in the 1490s. They sailed around the Cape of Africa into the Indian Ocean and set up little trading forts and then started to encroach in a little bit more. Then the Spanish showed up after the Portuguese, then the French did, then the Dutch did, then the English did. The Russians tried to come in from the north. Eventually in this war, Britain used its fleet to blockade everyone and bottle them up in their harbors and destroy their fleets. And when the war is over, they gained control over all of India. Mr. Mulvihill used to show a movie called Mongol Pandi. I don't know if he shows that to you anymore. It's a funny Bollywood movie about this time period. It's actually a little later in 1857 with the Sepoy Mutiny, but you learn how Britain gains control over all of India, which was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It was a good day to be British. This is the launching of the British Empire as we understand it, today. The sun never set on British soil. This is because Britain will gain India. They will gain control over all of North America, meaning they already had the eastern seaboard of the US. They're going to gain control over all of Canada and the West. Okay, this is the area west of the Appalachians up to the Mississippi River, which is an enormous area. The Spanish would control everything west of the Mississippi River, but effectively Britain is elbowed out everybody else. Britain even gained control over the Philippines and Florida, but for reasons kind of obscure to me, they traded them back to Spain in order to get sort of concessions and promises of peace. And the rest is history, shall we say. There's a very famous British patriotic song called Rule Britannia. Now, it's not the national anthem. The national anthem of Britain is God Save the Queen. Queen when it's a queen, king when it's a king. You guys probably heard it at World Cup, tournaments and such. But slightly less well known is Rule Britannia. I'm sure you have heard it because every Austin Powers movie, every, you know, patriotic British movie, they always have it. They don't always have the lyrics. So I'll give you the refrain. The refrain goes, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never ever shall be slaves." Right? So it's a nod to the Navy, the British Navy. Britain's an island nation, and their Navy, ever since 1588, had given them dominance over the English Channel and the North Sea. And through this, they were able to win dominance over the world, basically. So the tempo, the tune, I'll hum it for you because I cannot sing and I'm awful at that. But I'm sure you've heard it before. It goes ba 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 ba. You didn't know this was a music class, did you? So people will sing that song in pubs on both sides of the Atlantic, from Boston to London. Everyone was happy to be British. And understand that pretty much all of the founding fathers are alive and well at this time. Most of them are young men, except for Ben Franklin, who was already rather old. He was about 49 at the time. Washington is in his late 20s, early 30s by this time. The only ones that are not really around are Madison and Hamilton. They're way too young. If they're even alive, they're just little babes, born in the 1750s. But the point here is that Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, these men of the Revolution in a short period here, were very proud to be British. Thank God that the British won. I mean, after all, if the French had won, we would be under domination of a Catholic absolute monarchy and their Native American allies. And we all know what, you know, white Europeans thought of the Native Americans at that time. They just thought that they would be dominated by these other peoples. They'd lose their liberties. After the Glorious Revolution, they're very happy to be part of this enlightened empire. What a great time to be British. How could it all go so badly in just, you guys know, in 13 years, we'll be declaring independence? Well, several reasons. Reason number one, Pontiac's Rebellion. The treaty that solves the 7 Years' War is known as the Treaty of Paris. All belligerents were invited except for the Native Americans. The French basically said, we're the ones that control this land in the West and in Canada, and we sign off on this treaty. And Native American tribes in Canada did not like this, but there was no major violence there. But out in the West, in the area that's Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, there were violent raids from Chief Pontiac and his Native American Confederation on English settlers coming over, right? So as you might imagine, in early 1763, when colonists in Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania and everywhere else get the word that they have won and they can go westward, there's a flood over the Appalachian Mountains of people looking for cheap land. You get kind of two types of people. Number one, sort of banking, surveying interests that want to go lay claim to the land and then flip it and sell it and make a fortune, but also sort of poor whites who are landless and they want to become yeoman farmers, and they're streaming over the Appalachian Mountains. And they're met with violence, Native American attacks on them and their settlements. To which George III had to make a choice. He had to either double down on this and send in more redcoats and try to put down this rebellion with violence, or he could cut a deal. And he finally decided to cut a deal. He decided that prudence was probably the better part of valor here, meaning he didn't want to bite off more than he could chew. He said, why don't I quit while I'm ahead? I've won the world. Why should I bother with this? This intensely angered colonists in British North America. The king issues, King George III now, he's finally king in 1763, he issues what he calls the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And this basically forbids any colonists from going west of the Appalachians. If they do, in order to preserve the peace, British redcoats who took over those French fortresses in the Mississippi River Valley, British redcoats will be dispatched to burn down these settlements and to evict all of these British colonists. So you have this weird phenomenon happening where people are still coming in and squatting and taking land they don't belong to, but they're also being evicted, essentially. And of course, you might imagine British colonists were enraged by this. How dare you? You side against us and you give land to the Native Americans. How dare you do that? And There's a real feel of betrayal. Understand why the whole war was fought. The war was fought largely by British colonists to go west to take land. That's what precipitated the whole crisis. And when the war was over, the king gained all of India and Canada and everything else. And colonists were told, thanks for the good fight. Now go back to Connecticut and just live your daily lives. So people were really enraged at this. They made little fake dummies, like these are known as effigies. They would make effigies of King George and light them on fire and curse the king. And a couple months back, they were singing, God Save the King. And now they were saying something a little more, colorful, shall we say. So lots of anger about that, about the king siding with Native Americans over British colonists and the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Number two, there also was a feeling that the colonists were no longer really British. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, but the war created these conditions to sort of make people aware of it. And here's what I mean. The British government took some 30,000 redcoats and stuck them in North America, and they marched from one end of the continent to the other. And they came into contact with all of the subjects of their countrymen, right? All these British colonists from Maine all the way down to Georgia, they came into contact. Everybody saw redcoats up close, and they didn't quite like what they saw. So what did they see? Number one, coming into contact with people, because understand, most British colonists by this point were born in America. They had high birth rates. Sure, there was migration in, but you were limited to how many people you saw that were new to North America. These were countrymen who were from the mother country. Most colonists had never even been to the mother country. They were aware that they were British colonists and that the mother country was over the ocean, but they didn't really see Brits up close. Now they did, and they said, you guys are kind of weird. Here's what I mean. Number one, in the British military, they had a very strict, one would call it draconian sense of punishment. So for instance, in the British military, they don't do this anymore, but this was a historical phenomenon. Officer corps, positions in the officer corps were based on nobility, right? So if you were an enlisted man, if you joined, or if you were drafted as a private or an ensign in the Navy, you were at the lowest level. You were just a regular Joe, just a regular person. If you were a captain or an admiral or a major or a general or a colonel or any high up level in the officer corps, you had to be nobility. You just had to. And the nobility had certain privileges, and they did at home. They could vote, they owned land, they, had all these privileges legally and socially that other people didn't. And that crossed over into the military too. Now, in British North America, we did not have a nobility. Even men like George Washington, who were vast landowners and, owned tobacco plantations and slaves, they were not nobility. Now, George Washington joins, the militia, the Virginia militia, to go fight against the French and their Native American allies. And he is Colonel Washington, but he's looked down upon. People kind of ridicule the colonial military effort. They look at us and they say that we were undisciplined, that we would break ranks and just run away. A lot of colonists just said, well, my farm's just 5 miles off here. I'm going to run away after a defeat to the French. So the British, on the other hand, felt that they were disciplined, they were organized, they were 3,000 miles from their homes defending us in a war that we started. They didn't respect us. So we looked at them like they were too strict and too rigid. And they looked at us like we were lazy and selfish. Where this really comes to a head is in the punishments. The military does not mess around with punishments. It's not like regular society where you get, a regular sense of justice and fair trial and witnesses. You have military tribunals, and especially in the field of military, if you are stealing property, drunk on duty, late for drill, if you run away in the face of an attack, you can be severely punished. You can be executed right on the spot for that. And a lot of British colonists living in British North America were severely disciplined. They would pull your shirt off and have you flogged in front of everybody. Now, to colonists, this conjures up images of slavery. Slaves are ones who are whipped for indiscipline. A free man a yeoman, is never treated like that. In America, we had less of this hierarchical understanding where you could treat free people that way. And so colonists start to feel that they're more free, they're more democratic, and that the Brits really aren't this wonderful, free, enlightened society we imagine them to be. And they disrespect us. Massachusetts alone was responsible for fighting and defending British North America from France and its Native American allies, and experienced 2,000 deaths, just that one colony alone. Yet the Brits make this funny little song about us, right? I'm sure you guys all know Yankee Doodle. This is a song that everybody learned in nursery school when they were really young. My son even knows it. I taught it to him as well. But a lot of us as Americans haven't really looked at this. So, Yankee Doodle. It's written the same year as Rule Britannia, and it's quite a bit different. Yankee Doodle's written in 1763, and it's written by a British officer to make fun of Americans. So in this sense, Yankee is not referring to New England yeoman farmers who are very hardworking Puritans. It just means American. Okay, Yankee means American. Doodle, in case you wondered, is a British slang term for fool. So the term really means American fool. And you guys all know the lyrics, right? Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. Why is he riding on a pony? That was to ridicule Americans who British people thought we were uncultured. We're not of noble gentlemen. A gentleman rides upon a white steed. These little Yankee fools, these yeoman farmers that don't know anything, sort of ignorant backwood hicks, they ride on a donkey and they think they're gentlemen. And so this was to ridicule. They would sing this song in pubs in London and just make fun of how silly and stupid Americans were. Next line, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. I'm sure you guys know the song, right? You guys ever wonder why he called it macaroni? What on earth does that mean about anything? What it's referring to, macaroni at the time, was a term for these clubs in Italy, where sort of like salons in the French Revolution, where, you know, not just noblemen, but men who were educated and talented would sit in, you know, coffee shops and salons and talk about philosophy and religion and politics. And they would all dress in high fashion. It was for elite members of the community. These clubs were called Macaroni Clubs. Some of them in France are called Jacobin clubs, but that's what it was called in Italy. And so macaroni then became like the slang term for high fashion, just like what a gentleman might wear. So what they're saying is that in America, they're so removed from sophistication and trends and world fashion that they think all you got to do is put a feather in your cap and you're like dressed for the prom, right? So this is, and perhaps this is, you know, offensive on you know, on my point of view, but this is kind of how I feel when I meet folks who are from rural America. Like I took a group of Millikan students back in 2011 and 2012 to Europe. And, you know, we had 10 or 12 people. And when you don't have a full bus, they merge you with other groups from America. And we met this wonderful group from Alaska. They were very nice people, but I couldn't help but just sort of laugh at how plain and simple their lives were. Like they had experienced nothing. Like they didn't know anything about big city life or anything like that, right? Like all of our kids, we went to Spain on this trip. All of our kids knew a little bit of Spanish because we grew up in Southern California, and quite literally, these teenagers were asking our teenagers like, hey, that's cool. How do you say hello in Spanish? How do you say goodbye? How do you say taco? And we're just shaking our heads going, wow, these Alaskan kids are so cute. They're just adorable, right? It wasn't that I hated them, but I looked at them as small town people. Like they were amazed. We got to talking, the adults and me, and they were amazed that I was from Southern California and that I had driven on freeways before. Because where they lived, it was all just 2-lane roads and they had never been on a freeway in their lives. And they were just in awe of me. And I just sort of like, you know, it was a weird cultural experience. And that's kind of our view of rural America, right? They haven't really seen anything. They haven't lived. They don't know big city life. That's what British people during the 7 Years' War came to believe about British colonists and made fun of us. And we didn't think that was very nice of them to do that kind of stuff, but it's absolutely true. Conversely, and this may be counterintuitive and weird to you, but we felt that the British were vulgar and lewd And what that means is that they cursed a lot, they told dirty jokes, because most of the enlisted men anyway, were from big cities where they had experienced all that stuff. Most of our soldiers were small farm town boys who had never been into a big city and never experienced anything. So this is something that's not well known. Europeans are actually quite a bit more vulgar than Americans, like because of our films, and they, spread throughout the world. People think, oh, American culture is so vulgar, and there's aspects of it that are, but just on a person-to-person interaction, Europeans swear a lot more than us, and they're much more direct about certain things. For instance, you guys here in the States, if you have to relieve yourself, you ask, may I use the restroom, right? Can I go to the bathroom? It's a mystery. Nobody knows what happens in there. Nobody wants to know. In Europe, they're much more direct. It's very appropriate in Europe just to say, I need a toilet. Whereas in America, it's like, ooh, that grates on my ears. TMI, I don't need to know all that, right? Just say you need a bathroom or a restroom. If you ask for a bathroom in England, they'll take you to a place where there's a bathtub. They don't know what the heck a bathroom is. They say, they have their own fancy terms like WC or the loo, but most people just say, hey, I need the toilet. Where's the toilet? Very appropriate in France just to say toilette, I need a toilet. And people just say, okay, it's a human function, go ahead. In America, it's like, ooh, that's kind of gross. So they drank more than Americans. They spat, they swore, they did all these things that Americans just felt, ooh, they're unsophisticated and gross, and we don't really like British people. And of course, culture shock. It's very fascinating, but if you've ever been to the mother country, if you've ever been to Britain, it ain't America. It's a lot different. Now, there is a common language that binds us together, but it's kind of gone through some bizarre evolutions. Now, English, believe it or not, it's very widespread. There's, multiple countries that speak it. There's actually very little, if you're a linguist and you study this stuff, there's very little variation between English from country to country, particularly the US and Canada. There's really no difference. Just a few accents, but the vocabulary is the same. You'll notice Australia, New Zealand, very similar. Americans can't even tell that accent apart by and large. But even going to South Africa, those are English-speaking countries, you guys can get by there. It's a little off though. If you ever go, you guys might know that they use a totally different vocabulary for everyday stuff, right? So I'm sure they in Britain use a lift, and you might say, what's that? It's an elevator. They just call it something different, right? In Britain, they have a flat. And if you don't know what that is, that's what we call your apartment, right? So we have roommates in our apartment. They have flatmates. That's what they refer to it as, right? We wear tennis shoes or sneakers. They buy trainers. I'll never forget someone asking me that in Britain once if I needed a new pair of trainers. And I had no idea what the heck they were talking about. When I went to a grocery store in London, I'll never forget this. I walked through the door, and the guy who was the greeter at the door, the old man, he greeted me with a sentence that I did not understand at all, and I needed an English to English translation. I walked in, I was kind of looking around, and he clearly saw I was looking for a shopping cart. If you're from the Midwest, you might call it a shopping basket. In Britain, they don't call it that. They call it a shopping trolley. And so he uttered to me, he said, "Oi, mate, fancy a trolley?" That's my English accent. It's not very good. But nonetheless, I was stunned. I was shocked. And I just said, I don't understand anything of what you just said to me. And so he pointed at the carts and said, fancy a trolley. Oh, fancy. Like, do I want a trolley? Oh, a trolley's like, okay, all right. It might as well have been in Greek. It was practically a different language. And this goes on and on and on, right? There's all this confusion. Why on earth in England do they call French fries chips? That's bizarre. Then you raise the question, what do they call chips? Oh, they call chips crisps? What on earth is that, right? They call cookies biscuits? That's just weird, right? It just gets stranger and stranger. They don't use the term scone, they say scone. They're just bizarre that way, right? And then they spell everything weird, right? Color has a U in it, favor has a U in it. Center is C-E-N-T-R-E, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of these things you might say, well, these are just silly differences. This doesn't add up to a revolution. You're right, but identity is a powerful thing. Once you give a name to something, to a group of people, they are now an other. And this term, Yankee, really comes into existence in the 1760s. It's this term that is really coined by British people to refer to British colonists. Now, when you have British people and British colonists, it's the same people. But now they start saying Americans or Yanks or Yankees. And we started to really see each other as different peoples. And part of that was pronunciation, but part of it was their military style, and part of it was their fashion, and part of it was just all this stuff. Okay, so moving into when things are going to start to heat up. Number 3, death and taxes, 1765 to 74. So you have this gentleman here. This is King George III. Now, this is really macaroni right here. Look at that. That is just macaroni. He's wearing this incredibly intricate clothing for the nobility and for the royal family. The point of this slide is to demonstrate to you all that in Britain, the elite, the nobility, the king, they dressed in this kind of high fashion. No one in America did. Not George Washington, not Thomas Jefferson, not James Madison, not Benjamin Franklin. No one. Not John Hancock, one of the richest Americans. Nobody did. Nobody, A, had the money for this, and B, understood what fashion was. Okay, fashion will originate out of, you know, these academies in Europe, and it takes sometimes years to actually penetrate into America. And even when it does, it's like, we don't have the fabric, we don't have the cloth, we don't have the money for it. And plus, it would just seem out of place if you wore that. And so this created this division too, is that the nobility of Europe dressed like this, and they said, you know, colonists are not able to climb up to this highest level, and they need our, you know, tutoring and mentoring, because we have these great clothes and we're in this sort of elite club. It adds to sort of, you know, blocking everybody else out. Okay, so the war, all these other things that I mentioned, the accents, the, you know, stiff punishments of the British military, even the Royal Proclamation of 1763, those all contributed, but by and large, the biggest contributing factor of the revolution was the debt that had been incurred due to the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and now there was going to be taxes to pay that bill. This was the most expensive war in human history. I think when you studied it last year, Mr. Mulvihill's class, he calls it, you know, this is sometimes called the first global war, or not World War I or the First World War, but like, you know, a world war. Because it was fought on multiple continents. It's fought in the Caribbean, it's fought in North America, it's fought in Europe, it's fought in Asia, and it was incredibly expensive. The British government really makes peace in 1763 because they're bankrupt, and so are all of their enemies. And the next year, 1764, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, this is like their Secretary of the Treasury, he goes to the king and he says, we are broke and we will face catastrophic results if we don't start raising taxes in a huge way. And the king could not raise taxes on his own. He could on a few things like ship money, tonnage, and poundage, but most of these taxes that are going to be levied needs parliamentary authorization. So King meets with parliamentary leaders and says, what are we going to do? Our people are taxed up to their eyeballs here. Remember, colonists had never been taxed directly. They always raised their own revenue from their own pockets and ran their own government. And so finally, King and Parliament thought it would be wise, hey, these colonists started this war. They benefited from this war because now there's no threat from the French anymore. They now can sleep easy at night because there's no enemy that's outflanking them and surrounding them. They should pay their fair share too. And so basically, to balance the budget, the first taxes are going to be implemented. The very first one will be known as the sugar tax. Notice that it's a tax that pretty much, it's what's called a staple. In every kitchen in North America would be a sugar bowl. Everybody bought it. Everybody had it in their kitchen. So let's tax it so we can raise revenue. As you might imagine, all hell's going to break loose in North America. British colonists had always operated under the assumption that they were quasi-independent, that the only real interference they had from Great Britain was sort of mercantilist laws like navigation acts that they had to, you know, buy British goods, but they could always get out of that. All you had to do is, you know, I really want to buy French or Dutch sugar from the Caribbean. It's cheaper than English sugar. I need it for my molasses business. and it's just too expensive from Britain. And you would just, you know, whine and complain to the colonial official at the dock who was unloading this stuff with his clipboard, and you might slip him 20 quid. It's 20 pounds sterling. And they would just say, okay, I didn't see anything. So you would just bribe officials and kind of get away with it. And so colonists were largely pretty happy. No direct taxation ever. Now came direct taxation, and people will protest vehemently. The Stamp Act of 1765, same thing. Now, this is not stamps the way you guys think. This is not postage stamps. This is an ink stamp, like an official seal of the government. And stamps were required for all kinds of documents. So what would you need a stamp for? If you got married, you would need the government to put its seal of approval on it. Not the government of Massachusetts or Virginia, but the government of Britain. And you had to pay a tax to them. Land sales, if you bought land or sold land, you needed a stamp for it. If you got married, if you got divorced, if you bought slaves, if you sold slaves, if you did anything legally, you would need a government stamp on it. In addition to this, stamps will also be required on what the British government referred to as sin taxes. So these are things, government taxes things for different reasons. Number one is revenue, like we need taxation so we can run government services. The other one is to discourage you from doing something. As you probably are well aware, we tax the heck out of tobacco in California. I didn't even realize this until I traveled around and found out, oh, cigarettes are actually pretty cheap, but they're $10 or whatever they are in California. I don't smoke, I don't really know. But sometimes I'll walk into a gas station, I'll go, goodness, it's $9 or $10 for a pack of smokes. Most of that, probably 3/4 of that, is taxation to discourage people from smoking. Same thing here. Taxes were put on liquor, taxes were put on tobacco, taxes were put on dice and playing cards. So not only have you made lawyers angry, because lawyers would be angry over the stamps for, you know, legal documents and such, but you've made sailors in big cities happy. So the city most prone to the anger here would be Boston. Although there was anger all up and down the Atlantic coastline, Boston is the city that is just absolutely bananas out of control. In fact, I was debating someone the other day on this because we were kind of talking about what's going on in Portland, right? As you probably have heard, there have been nightly protests in Portland ever since the murder of George Floyd on, I think, May 28th or 29th. So it's going on something like 100 days now. To some extent, they've gotten violent, but Portland has a reputation of being full of like hotheads, very animated, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people said, you know, Minneapolis was the city of George Floyd, and they've calmed down at this point, but Portland is still marching and burning things down and spray painting stuff. This was essentially the reputation of Boston as well. People just thought, wow, look at all those hotheads in Boston. They're literally burning effigies of King George. They are spitting on redcoats. They are tarring and feathering people, which is a lot funnier in cartoons than in real life. This is where you take hot tar and you strip the clothes off of a tax official and you pour hot tar all over them, let it cool, and then rip it off, sometimes killing them, but seriously disfiguring and scarring people. Boston was just absolutely enraged at this and out of control. Massachusetts will be the best educated colony. Where these ideas of no taxation without representation spread and really thrive, and everybody's aware of it. And it's the city that's most connected to global trade, where this is going to affect people's income and livelihood. Understand that this has nothing to do with the level of taxation. This is often misunderstood. Too many people don't understand the American Revolution. The British were not taxing American colonists into oblivion. That is a myth. These taxes were actually a lot lower than the taxes in Great Britain. I forget the estimates, but I think it's something like 1/10 of what was being paid at Great Britain at the same time. We were being told to pay just pennies instead of what they were paying in Great Britain, which was substantially more. But it's not about the level. The argument is no taxation without representation. Now, John Locke would have said no taxation without consent, but it means the same thing. How do citizens give consent to the government to allow taxation? You allow them to elect representatives. That's why colonists had no problem paying their local colonial assemblies, because they got a say, they got a vote in it. We did not get a vote in the parliament in Great Britain. And so there were boycotts. Every single commodity that was taxed, like sugar and later tea, Colonists boycotted it. They said, do not buy it. And this is amazing. This is before social media, and people had to actually like go to printing shops and print out forms one at a time and pass them out on cold street corners in February and January. And still, they were very effective. People boycotted. They protested. They went out and demonstrated. It's an old American tradition. And, oops. Sorry about that. Riots. Protests. Okay. That's an American tradition as well, is sort of the riot along with the protest. Vandalism. People, in the most crazy example of this in Massachusetts, they went to the governor's house, Governor Hutchinson, after the Stamp Act was passed. They then broke into his home. He wasn't there. And they proceeded to dismantle his home from the top to the bottom, literally like taking hammers onto the roof and like with the claw ripping the shingles off one at a time, and then working their way to the bottom, to the basement. And when they were done, there was nothing. They didn't burn his house down. They tore it apart and then carried off everything of value and just completely disappeared it. So, hey, this is a fine tradition in America, is that the colonists were rather unruly. Colonial legislatures get together and they voice opposition. They pass these sort of resolutions, which are not quite law. Sometimes Congress will do this where they don't have authority. Congress will say, well, we can't actually do anything about it, but we want to condemn what China's doing in their northwestern province to Uyghurs there, Muslims in China, and they're being really awful to them. And so shame on you. Same thing here. Colonial legislatures passed these resolutions essentially saying the king is wrong, parliament's wrong, you need to repeal this. Now, they do briefly in 1766. Most historians believe that had the British Parliament not repealed all of these taxes, particularly the stamp tax in 1766, there might have been a revolution 10 years earlier than there actually was, because things were so out of control. It wasn't just confined to Boston. That's where it originates, but then it spreads all up and down the Atlantic seaboard to every major city in America, and it just became ungovernable. And so Parliament repealed all these taxes in 1766. They repealed all the taxes and passed what they called the Declaratory Act, which basically said, look, we're going to repeal these taxes to make you all happy, but don't get too big for yourself. We could tax you again anytime that we want. And largely things calmed down for about a year. Then there was a change in government. The prime minister stepped down, a new prime minister, Pitt stepped down, and the new one, Charles Townshend, comes to power. And again, the Chancellor of the Exchequer comes to him and says, we are broke. We owe a fortune. We'll never pay this back. And our people here in Britain are ready to riot over these really crippling taxes. These spoiled, rotten colonists won't even pay us a couple of bucks. And they are the richest place in the empire. This is often not also known. Britain's elite class was far richer than the elite class of British North America, but the average British colonist was the richest person anywhere in the world at the time, on average. The average British colonist was a yeoman farmer who owned about 40 acres, was independent, self-employed, had a trade, and was very comfortable. The average person in Great Britain was still a landless individual, a peasant, a serf, a tenant farmer, or a sharecropper who had nothing and had really no hope or no future. So why shouldn't we have paid a little bit more? Everybody had read, because education was so prevalent in North America, everybody had read the teachings of John Locke, or at least understood them, and said, it doesn't matter if it's a penny. It's the principle of it. If they can raise it to a penny, guess what? They could raise it as high as they want. They could take all of our money, and we would have no say in it whatsoever. In fact, there's negotiations. Men like Benjamin Franklin actually go to Great Britain and try to negotiate some kind of truce. And he says, why don't you offer us representation? And they consider it, the British do, for a bit, but then they finally decide that would just be impossible. How on earth would you have in Parliament in London representatives from Massachusetts who aren't living there? And remember, this is not the time like today where, hey, I live in Washington, D.C., but my district is home in Long Beach, California. You know, most of you probably, Lowenthal is your congressman. you can fly back and forth in just 5 hours. It's no big deal. This was a time when it took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. So just because of geographic isolation, they said, it's not possible. We just can't do this. And so they turned down that opportunity. More taxes come in 1767, and it's even worse than it was before. Not just tea and stamps and sugar, but everything will be taxed. And this is when things get very, very, very intense. And this went on for several years. This goes on from 1767 to about 1770. For 3 years, colonists are just going ballistic. Kind of imagine things right now in America where we think that, you know, things are dying down here and there, but again, another instance of police brutality, another shooting of an unarmed person of color. There was one in Kenosha, Wisconsin a little while ago, Jacob Blake. And this is the roots of a more fundamental problem, right? And the same thing with the American Revolution, that it wasn't going to go away. This was an issue that was going to come back, and the British kept thinking, this will die down, and then it kept creeping up over and over again. So, there were boycotts. There were agencies like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty that got together and tried to organize boycotts and protesting and everything else to make just life miserable for British soldiers and tax collectors in North America. And Boston, being the most difficult city to govern, was actually going to be occupied. Things get so out of control there that on October 1st, 1768, the British send in 4,000 soldiers to Boston. Now, I want you to note something. Boston at the time was a city of 16,000 people, and 4,000 redcoats were sent in. That's one soldier for every 4 people. That is the equivalent that if Millikan High School, let's say we had a riot or a series of fights at Millikan, and the admin responded by asking 1,000 armed soldiers to come in and patrol Millikan, so that there was one soldier for every 4 Millikan students. That would mean that in every one of your classes, there would be about 7 or 8 soldiers all standing there patrolling you. You would not like that. I would not like that. It would make me feel like a criminal. There's this weird psychology about this, and I'm wondering how you guys feel about this. So, for instance, I went to Mexico in 2009. It was one of these cruises. And I'll never forget, I remember getting off the cruise ship in Puerto Vallarta and walking off the ship, and there were 2 Mexican soldiers from the Marines, and they had machine guns, and they were there to guard the ship from anybody who might mess with it. Now, some people got off the ship, and the first thing they said was, oh, that's nice. That makes me feel safer because we have guards. And I had the exact opposite reaction because I didn't feel it was that dangerous in Puerto Vallarta until I saw that. And I said, geez, what the heck is going on in this town that they need armed soldiers with machine guns guarding this cruise ship? I mean, that's kind of crazy. I didn't feel threatened by them or anything, but if they were patrolling like every corner of the city, I would feel like, geez, I don't feel very comfortable here. This is not very free. Likewise, people in Boston just said, we feel like an occupied people. And this, of course, created a toxic relationship. Boston would be occupied from 1768 all the way until 1775. And it was the city that was just ungovernable. People were unbelievably angry at the redcoats, and you had this toxic relationship. Part of it was that they had their guns and they pointed them at people and ordered them around. Part of it was because protests are going to be more limited because there's, you know, soldiers everywhere. Part of it was because soldiers had a couple of days off a week and they would go and try to get jobs in Boston, and that pushed out other people from their jobs. There were people who came to Boston and they just kind of, you know, went from house to house in certain neighborhoods and offered to do odd jobs. And now redcoats on their day off would be competing with those jobs. So people ridiculed the redcoats. They made fun of them. If you read your textbook, the famous insult for the redcoats is that they called them lobsters. Get it? Because lobsters are red. So it's like, ooh, that burns. That's a big insult. I guess it's an insult for 1770. And so this will erupt in a very infamous incident, and that's the Boston Massacre. Now, was it really a massacre? Not really in our understanding of it today. It was an unfortunate event. Here's the facts. A redcoat was going door to door asking for jobs, and he was just trying to find work. He knocked on the door of Boston family's home. There was a young boy about 7 years old, that answered the door. He did not like redcoats or no good dirty lobsters. And the gentleman said, "Hello, young boy. I'm looking for work. Could you ask your mother or father if they have any chores that need to be done?" And the little boy said, "Well, my parents aren't home, but you could go clean out my bucket for me." And he didn't quite use that phrase. He used the more colloquial term, but every home had a bucket for urination and defecation in it. Okay. I know a lot of people have a tendency to think, oh, the past, it's so glorious. I wish I could go back in time. You really wouldn't want to go to any period earlier than the one we're living in now. And especially when you go back more than 100 years without modern sanitation, cities were very gross and awful places where animals, large ones, horses, oxen, would just urinate and defecate in the streets, and it would just sit there forever. And so cities just smelled wretched. They were gross. And people did that in their homes because there were no toilets, right? You didn't have a sink or anything like that either. You'd have to go, there would be one street corner basically in your neighborhood where there'd be a little water pump where you go out with a bucket and fill it up. And there was another bucket that you used as your toilet, and you would just throw it out into the streets. And this little boy said, "Hey, why don't you go clean that out for me?" So the lobster kind of grabbed the kid and slapped him around a little bit. Didn't hurt him all that bad, but a crazy rumor started to spread around Boston that a redcoat had murdered a little child. And so before anyone checks out the facts, there's an enormous riot going on outside the customs house. This is where all the money's kept from all the taxes. So citizens are out there in the middle of the night in Boston in March when it's still winter time. Bostonia, if you've ever been to Boston in the winter, it's bitterly cold, but they don't care. Okay. If you guys have ever seen a Red Sox game, you understand what I mean. They are crazy in Boston. They are unbelievably passionate and rather angry. And they went out to the customs house and they were about ready to burn it down. They were so angry over this rumor that had not been verified. So a small contingent of redcoats, no more than about 24 or so redcoats, come out to try to deal with this crowd of hundreds. And they're yelling at them, telling them, "Disperse, go home." The crowd starts to attack the redcoats. They start to throw snowballs, rocks, clubs, all kinds of other stuff at the redcoats. And in the confusion, one of the redcoats opened fire. After one of them fired, the others felt there must have been an order given, all start to fire. And at the end of all of this, 5 colonists are killed. Now, it is a tragedy. It is terrible. Is it a massacre? I would say probably not. A massacre usually is when authorities intentionally set out to murder a civilian population. We'll look at that later. It happened in American history, I'm sorry to say, to the Native Americans, to Black communities at certain times. But this does not really qualify. This was just an unfortunate incident that happened because of confusion, basically. How can I say this? Well, there was a trial. Amazingly, the trial was held in Boston. They didn't take the redcoats out to London and give them a trial there where people were more cool-headed. They tried them right there in Boston. And amazingly, a lot of people don't know this, the redcoats got an attorney, Mr. John Adams, Mr. Revolutionary, second president of the US. He actually thought, now here was John Adams' mind. If I could sum up a man who was much more intelligent than me and gifted, his basic position is that the taxes are terrible, but violence cannot be excused for any reason. That the mob had provoked this attack. The redcoats only fired to defend themselves, that they were confused, that Captain Preston, who commanded that regiment, did not tell anyone to open fire. And in fact, the trial proved that it was the Boston mob who was daring them to fire and said, like, I dare you to fire. You don't have the guts. And someone heard fire and panicked and shot. It is a tragedy, but I would say hardly a massacre. The problem, though, is how this is received by the press. Because Boston had its own newspaper, they published the story, the Bloody Massacre in Boston. They show Paul Revere's, little painting of it, which is way inaccurate. And these images and this story goes all up and down the Atlantic. So people as far away as Savannah, Georgia, are tearing their hair out saying, "Oh my goodness, the redcoats are coming for me and my children next. This is terrible." However, a very weird occurrence happens. Even before the Boston Massacre happened, in early March of 1770, Parliament in Britain had voted to repeal all taxes. And by the time that the word comes to America, tensions are very high, but they then start to calm down. This is a weird period of the revolution from March of 1770 to December of 73, where, excuse me, I'll call it the calm before the storm. Had the British government just done nothing, it's very possible that we would be living in a country right now that's in the British Commonwealth, just like Canada is. A lot of people don't know this, but Canada today, although an independent country, is still technically part of what's called the British Commonwealth. And the way that works is Britain sort of offered independence to a lot of its former colonies, but there was always a catch. They would always say, okay, Australia, Canada, you are technically independent, but we reserve the right to come back and take over the ports and recolonize you if we see fit. They would never do that today. Canada could easily defend themselves and it wouldn't happen. But still to this day in Canada, in every courtroom, Queen Elizabeth II's picture is there. She's technically the head of state. And the British flag still flies over most government buildings in Australia, in the Bahamas, in Canada, and these old Commonwealth nations. That might have been us had nothing happened, but the British government did something unbelievably stupid, and they passed the Tea Act in the fall of 1773, in November. Now, again, it takes several weeks for that information to arrive, and when information arrives in Boston 3 years after the Boston Massacre, things had calmed down. Now, there were still 4,000 redcoats in Boston, but there were no taxes anymore. Everywhere else in the colonies had gotten over it at this point. There's no more taxes, I'm fine. And then word spread that the British Parliament was now going to put a tax on tea. Now, the Tea Act is rather complex, but here's what you need to know. The British East India Company had gone bankrupt in 1773. Essentially, the Dutch were better at it. The Dutch had started colonizing Indonesia much earlier than the British got into India. The Dutch were undercutting the British everywhere, and the Dutch were very good smugglers. And the Brits got really angry at this. And their largest corporation, the British East India Company, was on the verge of bankruptcy. So this tax was not going to be a revenue bill. It was a bailout, basically. By 1773, it's now been 10 years after the war, the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War. And by and large, the debt had been paid off. This is sort of the irony of all of this, that Britain didn't need to pass this tax to save their treasury. They just passed it to save one corporation. And the way it worked was, it's rather complex, but these navigation acts and mercantilist policies, the British East India Company would be exempt from all of them. Normally, they'd have to ship all of their tea to Britain, where they'd be packaged up in British factories and then shipped. They said, you know what, you could package it in India and just ship it wherever you want. Costs went down and shrank for the British East India Company so they could compete. But what they wanted in return was they wanted the rights to sell exclusively in British markets. So now the Brits would have to really clamp down on smuggling. No more Dutch tea in Massachusetts. So import-export people like John Hancock lost their minds. That was their whole business, was basically smuggling, buying cheaper tea than the British tea and selling it to tea merchants all throughout the colonies. He imported and exported everything, but that was one of the things he did. So sailors are angry. It would cut into their business. Import-export people are angry. Merchants are angry. And most of all, the legal community, lawyers and educated people are just angry. It doesn't matter, because tea was cheaper than it had ever been. It was 1 penny a pound now. You had this tiny little tax on it. And so British government really misread the situation. They did one of the stupider things they did. They just felt colonists aren't going to be angry because the tax is so small. Again, the amount was irrelevant. It was just the fact. And so in response, the Sons of Liberty orchestrated the Boston Tea Party, which I'm sure you've heard of it. So word spreads to Boston that this new Tea Act is in effect, and the first shipment is set to arrive in December of 1773. Before the first ships from the East India Company arrive, angry colonists are at the port in Boston awaiting it, and angry, and they've got like hatchets and clubs, and they say, don't you dare unload that tea in our harbor because it's got a tax on it and this is tyranny. To which the captains of the ships just said, well, we'll just drop anchor, we'll lock up the cargo hold, and we'll just wait until the crowd disperses and we'll unload the tea tomorrow or next week. And so the Sons of Liberty met in secret. This is an organization run by Samuel Adams, John Adams' cousin. and they decided that they were going to destroy the tea, not let it come to American soil, make this sort of violent political protest by destruction of property, vandalism, basically. They didn't want to get caught, so they disguised themselves as the Mohawk tribe, as members of the Mohawk tribe that was operating and around and existed in New England. And the disguises worked. Nobody knew exactly who did this. And they destroyed several $100 million worth of tea, just dumping it into the harbor. And of course, there would be copycat crimes all up and down the British or the North American coastline. Now, Britain could have responded to this in one of two ways. What they had always done for a decade is when things got a little too hot, they would just back off and make the colonists happy. Because in Parliament, there were a few people that did stand up for us and say things like, you know, the colonies don't exist for revenue. We can't economically squeeze them to make our revenue. That's not why they exist. They exist for trade. They buy our goods. And we were the biggest market for British made goods. So all these British manufacturers would often come to Parliament and speak for the colonists and say, this is silly. Just repeal these taxes, make them happy, because with the boycotts, we're going out of business. The Crown and Parliament finally decided, no, we've babied these people enough. We're bringing down the hammer. So they passed a series of the strictest laws that anybody had seen since the Dominion of New England, which we talked about last week. Under the Coercive Acts, as they were called, colonists would refer to them as the Intolerable Acts, all freedom was extinguished in Boston and Massachusetts. So number one, the port of Boston was closed. A British fleet showed up of ships with more soldiers, and they just blanketed the harbor and said, no goods in, no goods out until you all pay for the tea. And then they went to the local Boston government and said, you guys all need to raise revenue and taxes to pay off that tea. To which the residents of Boston said, that wasn't us. That was the Sons of Liberty. You go track those people down and you put them on trial and you make them pay for it. But you can't punish the whole colony for what 20 men did. That's crazy. Well, they did, and they shut down the whole port. You guys live in a port town. Imagine what it would do to the economy of Long Beach if the federal government in DC just said, we're closing down Long Beach until you change something, right? Because of the actions of what maybe a handful of people did in Long Beach. It would devastate the economy there. It would be just terrible for everybody. And it would be an act of just brute unconstitutional authority. It's exactly what the government did. 2, the Massachusetts Government Act. Under this law, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was yanked out of Massachusetts, and a British general, was put in charge of all of Massachusetts, just as a dictator, pretty much. This is known as martial law, where you have a war situation, an invasion, a rebellion, and you just say the regular courts and police can't handle this. We're just going to send in the troops and declare martial law, which is a really scary thing to do. And most people would argue Boston was in no way close to that situation where you had to actually resort to that, but they certainly did it. Next one, town meetings are banned. You couldn't get 3 people into a church to complain about this, or you would be arrested. You had to get authority from the new government. No more colonial assembly, no more royal governor. It's just Thomas Gage, a British general. You had to write him and ask permission to have a meeting to complain, and he would always turn you down. Immunity was granted to British soldiers, so they could kill at will. Oops. Dang it, I did the same thing I did before. Sorry, excuse me. So they could kill Americans or British colonists and not pay any price. They would be given immunity. They would be brought back to London for a trial because the courts were all closed there. Oops. Yeah, immunity to soldiers, and then Quartering Act is below. Sorry about that. Quartering Act. What this means is, it's very interesting. So let me explain this. So essentially, in the olden days, before you had modern transportation, armies would march over long distances. They could only march 20 miles a day or so, and it was a huge army. And so they would, rather than make camp and set up a base somewhere, often they would come to a farmhouse and just knock on the door in the middle of the night and say, by proclamation of the king, you have to put us up for the night, and you have to feed us at your own expense. And so that law was passed, and they did quite a bit of that, marching all around Massachusetts. This was so much angered British colonists that we put it into our Bill of Rights. Some of you may know or may not know, the Third Amendment of the Constitution says no troops can be quartered in people's homes. The interesting thing about that is it's the only part of the Bill of Rights where we have never had an instance of it, and it never had a single case in America, not even in the Civil War where you had big armies marching around the place. Did you have a Third Amendment case? It's never happened. So it's sort of a weird, people might call it a vestigial part of the Constitution where it's really speaking to another area. The Army doesn't want to spend the night with you guys in your house. They have a huge base all over the place, and helicopters and, you know, Humvee trucks can just take them anywhere. So it's old fashioned, but they did that. Last thing is the Quebec Act. This had nothing to do with the Intolerable Acts. It was a separate law. It just happened to be passed the same day, but everybody thought it was a message to British colonists. Here's what it said. The area in the West, so this would be what's today Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Kentucky, Indiana, that area. That, remember, had been given to Native Americans. You know, British troops are stationed there in fortresses, but British colonists wanted to move over and take it. Rather than allow that, the British government said, what we will do is add that area to what already exists in Canada, called Quebec, and will allow French migration from Canada down south of the Great Lakes into that region, because the idea being, hey, didn't the French get along better with the Native Americans than anybody? Let's let them come in there. You know, British colonists so anger Native Americans, it gets us involved in a war. The French always had great relations. Let them colonize the area. Again, the British just did not understand our mentality. People so coveted and so wanted that land in the West, and were so angry at this that they rioted and complained because of this. In opposition to this, we get really our first national government. In the spring of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies will meet in Philadelphia, and they'll call it the First Continental Congress. What was the only colony not represented? Georgia. Georgia was so new, it's founded in the late 1730s, early 1740s, and it was so dependent on Great Britain, it was a penal colony basically, is that redcoats ran the place, that it was thought just impossible that they could oppose Great Britain so outwardly. They would join the revolution the next year, but in 1774, they're not quite ready. And really, the First Continental Congress gets nothing done. They just argue, debate, because everybody is too timid except for the New England states. Massachusetts is ready. They feel our rights have been egregiously violated. Now, let's take a step back. What is happening? What is this all about? Really, this was an argument over taxation without representation that went back and forth. You know, colonists still, men like John Adams and Washington, they had said, we're very angry at taxation without representation. The king's wrong, but we have no right to use violence. That's just impossible. We need to fight this through the legal system and legal means. Once the Intolerable Acts are passed, the feeling was this was way too far. This was an escalation that is not warranted, and things are going to spiral out of control. We have no choice now but to try to organize a government, maybe declare independence. So Massachusetts is ready in 74. Their New England neighbors are as well. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire want to, but that's only 4 out of 12 or 13, however you want to count it. It's not enough. The rest of the country still views New England as hotheads. You know, like I said, Portland now has that reputation today. If you guys have been to Boston, it is technically a liberal city, but it's pretty rough around the edges, like New York and Philly are. The places today that are you know, much more liberal and, you know, much more willing to go out and demonstrate and march and protest are going to be Seattle and Portland, as you guys saw this summer, most likely. So men like John Adams get very upset that the First Continental Congress really achieves nothing. They talk about boycotts and non-importation agreements, and they write letters to the king and parliament begging them, please, you know, consider other means of going about this, and it just falls on deaf ears. When the Continental Congress disperses in the fall of 1774, John Adams goes home. He spends the winter in Massachusetts, just south of Boston, and he tells his wife, he says, I think it's all over. No one's coming to our aid. I'm just totally hopeless about this whole prospect. By the time that the Congress would resume and meet again in the spring of 75, the war had already begun, the war for independence, basically. How did things change so quickly? Well, the British no matter what they did, could just not stomp out the resistance. The men that had been in the Colonial Assembly now met in private. The men that had been in the militia still met in private. Now, what the militia was is basically analogous to our National Guard today. So like California has its own army, right? It can't march it into other states. It can't use it against the federal government, but it can use it to put down revolts and rebellions. Every state had one of these. Massachusetts had a militia, Virginia did, et cetera, et cetera. The reason for this was always to defend against the French and their Native American allies in a big war. Nobody ever thought the Massachusetts militia would be used to fight the British, but that would be exactly what happens in April of 75. The British, trying to snuff out this resistance to arrest the ringleaders of the Colonial Assembly and the Massachusetts militia that were still meeting, they started marching around different areas, getting intelligence reports, going out trying to arrest people. And there were spies who were constantly intercepting messages. Many women served in this sort of spy ring network. There were a lot of laundresses where, you know, British redcoats need to get their uniforms cleaned. They drop it off at a laundromat. Okay, I guess it's not a laundromat, but a laundry service. And there'd be, you know, women there that would sometimes flirt with the British soldiers and try to get information out of them and pass it along to the sons and daughters of liberty. So men like Paul Revere would get this information and then try to respond to it. This is the very famous instance where the Brits now realize that all eyes on the entire country are on the armory that is at Concord, Massachusetts. This is where the Massachusetts militia has all of their weapons. They have cannon, they have cannonball, they have guns, they have gunpowder, they have everything there. And nobody wants to rush to it too quickly. The redcoats feel it'd be a bit provocative if they just marched on it and seized it, because that would provoke, you know, the rebels in Massachusetts to do something. Likewise, the rebels don't want to go out and grab it because they probably don't have enough men to go out and liquidate the whole thing before the redcoats get there. So both sides are kind of keeping one eye on the armory, neither side wanting to go to it first. The redcoats decide to start marching in the middle of the night, late at night on April 18th, and try to get to Concord in the early morning and seize the armory before anyone knows what's going on. But the secret leaks. Men like Paul Revere get the information. They were told that there would be this signal, lanterns in the North Church in Boston, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. They get the lantern call. They go out and they ride through the countryside. And I'm sure you've heard the story. This is where Paul Revere alerts the community. He did not say the British are coming because that wouldn't make sense to them at the time because they thought of themselves as British too. What he said is the regulars are coming. The army is coming. And this alerted everyone in town. Everyone along the road from Boston to Concord. Men got out and just got their muskets, and they just sort of emerged as an impromptu army without much training or anything. Some of them had served in the militia, some of them hadn't. And they sort of line up in Lexington and decide they're going to block the road and not let the redcoats through. The redcoats arrive in mid-morning, and there's a standoff there. The captain controlling his men tell the colonists to step aside, that they're illegally blocking the road and they need to go through, and that their, you know, Massachusetts militia has been disbanded. This is an illegal assembly. And the colonists in the Massachusetts militia say, no, in fact, you are violating the British Constitution and we're not dispersing. This is the so-called shot heard around the world. No one yet knows, still to this day, who fired the first shot that started the Revolutionary War. Someone did. It might have been someone on the British side, might have been someone on the American side who panicked. Nobody knows. They tried to recreate this later through an investigation. Nobody gave any order to fire. Someone just started firing. Either they were nervous or they just wanted to start. The redcoats easily brush aside the Massachusetts militia that further retreats to Concord. They then regroup and get more people there. There was a tremendous amount of confusion. There was a lot of smoke from all the gunfire. And most Massachusetts colonists assumed the Brits were just burning people's homes because they couldn't tell what was going on. Rumors were flying around. And so men just came out of their homes and just started shooting at the British. They're able to turn back the redcoats at Concord, drive them all the way back into Boston. And the entire way, for many, many miles, the British had to sort of run with their sort of arms behind their neck because they were getting shot at on all sides. A lot of men, you know, these simple country farmers, they just came out, they saw all their neighbors shooting at the redcoats, and they just shrugged their shoulders and said, I guess I got to do the same. And they just started shooting at them. And so you have, on April 19, 1775, the first two battles of the American Revolution. Lexington, a very small skirmish. Concord, a bit of a bigger skirmish. One in which the colonists lose in Lexington, and then they win in Concord. But it shocked people that this ragtag group of militia people drove back the British Army into Boston. And then they dug in their trenches. And they surrounded the Brits in Boston, and they couldn't get out. A couple of months later, in June, the British would attempt to try to take the heights to the north of Boston, north of the Mystic River, in an area known as Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill. And although they do win, they take severe casualties, just appalling casualties. I forget exactly what the count was, but I think the colonists lost a few dozen or a few hundred, whereas the Redcoats lost thousands of soldiers. So even though it is a victory and they gain control over the heights on the north side of Boston, it's not a very easy victory for the Brits, and they lost thousands of lives at Bunker Hill. And so this causes the Second Continental Congress to snap into action. They finally are sort of lulled out of this, torpor that they were in, sort of a sleep almost. A Congress that was divided before now is unified under this. Nothing really provides clarity like, organized violence this way. They're not ready to declare independence yet. Most of them feel that if they just sort of continue to fight and resist, that there could be a negotiated settlement. Let's just go back to the way things were, repeal the taxes, repeal the Intolerable Acts, and we'll go back to the way things were. It wasn't to be. We would declare independence about a year later, but in the meantime, Congress starts to act as a national government. It had no authority to do it. There was no constitution written. It was just a bunch of men in 13 different colonies that wrote letters to each other and said, let's meet in Philadelphia. Every colony will have one vote. There'll be like a 5-person delegation. And, the majority of that, if 3 of the 5 decide to do something, that would be 1 vote for something. And then they're off and running. Number 1, this government just sort of says, we are going to adopt the Massachusetts militia. We're going to take it under our control to provide it food, training, weapons, sustenance, money, pay, everything. So this was a signal to the king that this was no longer just a Massachusetts rebellion. All 13 colonies were going to put their weight behind this revolt. Part of the reason they needed generals was that General Warren, the head of the Massachusetts militia, was shot and killed at Bunker Hill. And there was no head to this militia anymore. You probably know who they chose, but in May, they voted unanimously on Colonel Washington, George Washington, who was actually in the Congress at the time representing Virginia. Why Washington? Couple of reasons. Number 1, he did have probably the best military experience and was well respected. He did not have a great military record, but he was a colonel and fought in the French and Indian War, and he knew how to command men and combat. Second, and this is really much more important, a lot of people don't know this, it was done for political reasons. It was John Adams who actually appointed George Washington to the head of this, or at least nominated him, and then the Congress voted on it. There were other people that wanted the job. John Hancock's hand shot up when he said, hey, General Warren was killed, I'll take over. And everybody said, Hancock, do you have any military experience or training? Well, no, but how hard could it be? I'm rich after all, I know everything. So they tell Hancock to sit down. Adams felt, we need to send a message to Britain and the world that this is not a bunch of hotheads in Boston, that this was a continental-wide struggle. So they named a Virginian at the head to symbolize this is spiraling out of control, and that you're not just facing one colony, it's going to be 13. And it was a smart choice. Washington wins the war, can't really argue with success, and it did very much send that message. The story's rather incredible. Washington that day was honored with this commission. The Congress provided him a sword, symbolic of his commission as head of the Continental Army. It's no longer the Massachusetts militia, it's the Continental Army, sort of a national army. He then gets on his horse and rides from Philadelphia 2 weeks up to Boston, and he starts recruiting men for the army right there in Philadelphia and paying them out of his own pocket and riding up. Truly extraordinary. I said this one, they renamed it the Continental Congress. They pledged $2 million. They start borrowing to fund this army.
they start negotiating with the king, they being the Second Continental Congress. They actually send what's called an olive branch petition. That's what that means in quotes there. It's sort of a peace treaty, like a proposed peace agreement. But on July 5th of 1775, they get John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker and known as being a moderate who always said, we can't have revolution. He was one of the few delegates who would vote against independence. He just said, no violence, no revolution. The king has to see reason. So he was put in charge of drafting this petition, and they send it off in July. It would take 4 months to get a response. They do not get a response until November of 1775, at which time king and parliament say, no, who are you to negotiate with us? Here was the negotiation terms. The Continental Congress was saying, we will disband the Continental Army and pledge allegiance to you and end the war if you repeal the Intolerable Acts and you repeal the taxes. Sounds like a good deal to me. King and Parliament refused. They just said, how dare you? They got the reply in November of 75, and basically it said, surrender now or you will all be killed and hanged for treason later on. But if you surrender now, then you can at least keep your property and your lives. And whatever you think of the Founding Fathers, they were sincere in their beliefs. They did not back down from this. They believed in this cause, and they were willing to put their lives on the line. Had they fought poorly and had they been captured, they would have been executed. And they risked their lives and their property and everything to do this. So Benjamin Franklin is made the first postmaster general. So now we have a post office. Even before we have a country, we have an army, a marine, and a post office. We had no navy in the Revolutionary War. We couldn't really build ships and fight the British. But we would have a Marine Corps, an army in 75, and a post office and a Congress. Notice we're not even an independent nation yet, and we have sort of the beginning institutions of that. Okay. We negotiate with the Native Americans, the tribes in the various regions to basically to stay out of the conflict. Now, Native Americans, what side would they be more likely to fight on in this war? Without a doubt, the British. Now, the British always in prior periods were the greater threat, and the French were, be nicer to them, so to speak. But now that there's sort of a civil war in between British colonists and Brits overseas, the British were offering better terms. The Brits were good to their word to Chief Pontiac, saying, we're going to let you keep your lands here in the West. We'll defend you from the colonists, and they did. And they promised, if we win this war, we won't let the colonists go west. And so every single tribe in North America, except for two, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, fought on the side of the British. This begins a process, or rather it continues a process that already started, but would continue long afterwards. Every deal that the US government would strike with various Indian tribes to use against other Native American tribes, they would betray them. Right? The Oneidas and Tuscaroras, they used them as scouts, they used them as interpreters, they used them as guides. And after the war was over, they were supposed to promise them huge amounts of land and alliances, and then those are reneged upon. Basically, the US government is going to take their land and rip up that treaty. And the Congress is negotiating with them, saying, this is a war between British colonists and the British back home, so please stay out of it. The US invaded Canada. Hey, why not? It's there, right? A lot of people don't know this, but in June of 75, two generals, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, two New Englanders, both from Connecticut, I believe, they would be ordered to take their militias and march up into Canada, because the Redcoats are really in three places at this time. There's a rather large contingent around Boston that's being dealt with. Washington's dealing with them. There's a lot of Redcoats in the West, which there will be bands of, militia soldiers that will go west and fight with the Native Americans and the British there. The other areas, there were quite a few Redcoats up in what's today Quebec, like around Montreal and Quebec City. And so this is a long 500-mile march. It's an amazing story. I don't have time to get into it all, but we came that close to actually conquering Canada. Winter had actually set in too early. We laid siege too late when it got too cold, and we were forced to retreat and come out of there. But the idea was to neutralize the threat before reinforcements could come from Britain back into Canada. Maybe had we conquered Canada, it would be another province of the US today. Who knows? how things might have changed, but we failed at that. And Canada still has this in their understanding that America is always this country that's invaded them and they valiantly defended themselves. They fought us off in 75. They would fight us off again in 1813. More on that later. Now, one interesting dynamic that happens here is that the royal governor of Virginia basically was terrified because Virginia now started to join the revolution. The colonial assembly, you know, was operating in concert with the Congress and Massachusetts. And he was afraid for his life. So Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, flees to a ship like off the coast of Virginia, and then he issues this sort of edict. Lord Dunmore's proclamation is very interesting, and it's caught a lot of people's eyes now. This is December of 75, where he announces that all the slaves of Virginia are free, and if they could make it to British lines and they fight on the side of the British, they would be granted their freedom. So the war becomes a bit complex. Some people ever since have argued that the war was about slavery, about preserving it or keeping it. That's not really true. As hopefully I've demonstrated, the war sprung up because of different reasons. The war really originates in New England, where there was very little slavery, and it wasn't about slavery at all. But it does become about that, at least partially, in the South. In fact, in the North, in New England, most governments get rid of slavery. The first being Vermont in 1777. In the aftermath of declaring independence, Vermont says, this is not a good institution to have for a free and enlightened people. We're getting rid of slavery. Massachusetts does the same. In 1780, every New England state abolishes slavery as a result of the Revolution. Other states fought in a way to preserve slavery and to keep it longer. Now, what about our founding fathers that we love so much? It's complicated. I will say this, that Washington had already marched up to Boston to join the revolution in May of 1775, 7 months before Lord Dunmore threatened to free his slaves at Mount Vernon. Washington was not joining this war because of it. Now, he might have agreed with slave owners in Virginia that the British had no right to do this and I better win so I can keep my slaves. But that's not why he joined, and it's not why Jefferson joined either. They were well into the cause because of the taxation issue before. Okay? All right, escalation. So eventually we will declare independence in 1776. Here's why. Number one, the loss of life at Bunker Hill. And this has a way of really motivating people. The king and parliament were just not listening. When they got the casualty figures back, and you better believe that there were a lot of family members, a lot of noblemen who had been killed, brothers of, you know, men who served in parliament. They were so enraged that the colonists had killed thousands of their countrymen that they just said, I can't listen to an olive branch petition anymore. The olive branch petition was rejected. We tried to negotiate and the king didn't listen. So what choice do we have now? We could either surrender or we could fight on. Why didn't we surrender? Well, we actually had a pretty good victory in December of 75. Washington arrived. He beefed up the army there. He started training them. He started feeding them. He started equipping them. And he orders this rather amazing tactic where cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, way up in northern New York, are seized and brought hundreds of miles down to Boston, put in an elevated position, sort of pointed down at the British locations, and the British just retreated. This was a city that had been occupied for 7 years. Everyone in Boston hated the British, and now George Washington had liberated them. If you've ever been to Boston, there's a big park in the center of the town called Boston Common, and there's a statue of George Washington there. And I remember the first time I went, I was a little confused, and I said, why would they have a statue of a Virginian here in Boston? Right? There were a lot of Massachusetts patriots, Henry Knox, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock. Why not use one of them? Because those men didn't quite get the job done. It took Washington, who had the military experience, to come and liberate Boston, and he was forever loved because of it. More on that later. So because of this military victory, people now all of a sudden think, well, maybe we can actually do this. You know, we don't have to be so timid. A lot of people said it would be foolish to fight the British Empire. A lot of people now said, well, maybe not. Maybe we can win this thing. A lot of people are already saying, let's reach out to the French. Let's reach out to the Dutch. Let's reach out to the Spanish. They hate the English too. And then finally, the propaganda war. So this brings a gentleman into the discussion who is really, really fascinating, and that's Thomas Paine, or as I love to refer to him as T-Pain, right? You guys all know T-Pain, I'm sure. Well, this is the other T-Pain. So Thomas Paine, it's been said by the late, great Christopher Hitchens, an English writer and polemicist. He argues that Thomas Paine is simultaneously the greatest Englishman and greatest American who has ever lived. So what else can you say about the guy? He's born to very common means. He was born to a Quaker family in England, and he had failed at just about everything he ever did. He was a ladies' corset maker. He apprenticed to do that. Didn't like it, didn't really enjoy it very much. He was a tax collector for a while. He was a sailor for a while. And he just always thought that this kind of work was beneath him and he wanted to do other things. Paine represents this new class of gentlemen in England who doesn't quite fit into the scheme. Well-educated, incredibly smart, can write better than anybody else in England, but doesn't own land, isn't in the nobility, can't vote, and can't serve in Parliament, not in House of Commons or House of Lords. So there's no real place for him in society. And he's sort of, bridling at this. And he was constantly in trouble. He was constantly getting arrested and going to jail for writing pamphlets that really upset a lot of people. Colonists had all heard of him. He was very famous, or infamous, one might say. So Benjamin Franklin, one of the richest of the colonists, decides, I'm going to write to Thomas Paine. Writes to him in 1774 and says, I'm a big fan of your writing. How would you like to come to America? Things are very explosive here. Maybe you'd like to write about this situation. I will put you up at an apartment that I keep in Philadelphia, and you can just write to your heart's content. You don't even need a real job. So Paine says, this is great. This is the greatest gig I ever had. He goes to Philly, and within a couple of months, the first thing he writes is actually a fascinating condemnation of the slave trade. I highly encourage you to look at it. Thomas Paine, an incredible individual, way ahead of his time, the only founding father that was vehemently anti-slavery. Some Northerners like John Adams and Hamilton would often sort of say, they didn't like slavery, they thought it was a bad institution, but none of them were that vocal about it. Paine put his name on this pamphlet and put it out there, and it upset a lot of Southerners. They didn't like it. The second thing that he produces the next year, in early 1776, it comes out in January, is what he's remembered for in perpetuity, and that's Common Sense. He writes a 50-page pamphlet. It produces about 200,000 copies in the colonies, which means there's about one copy for every 10 people. So everyone in the colonies had either read Common Sense or had it read to them. And it's very interesting what he does. He doesn't write this in the language and address to sort of rich planters or rich import-export people, merchants like John Hancock. He writes it to the average yeoman farmer. He realized that the elites, the rich and the powerful and the lawyers and the men who wrote the laws, were already on the side of the revolution. The big question, the people that were neutral, sort of in the middle, fence sitters, a lot of people call them, like, which way is the wind blowing? Which way do I want to go, Britain or revolution? Was the yeoman farmer. And so Paine writes this in kind of simple language addressed to them. And we don't have time to get into all of it, but the beginning parts, he basically says, look, it is time to take the plunge, declare ourselves independent, become our own country. We can do this. If God had intended that Britain control America, why did he make them so far apart with an ocean between them? Why did he make America so big and Britain so small, right? And so this is in language that actually farmers could read it and go, yeah, we can do this. We're bigger than them. We're far away from them. We can do this. The last portion of Common Sense is just a blasting of monarchy. He just says monarchy is the stupidest idea anyone ever came up with. Does anyone really believe that George III is the greatest, most qualified leader because his father was also a king? It's the stupidest way to select leaders. We should have elections. And people started to say, yeah, this makes sense. We don't want to become part of the British Empire anymore because they're a monarchy. This really turned people's minds. There's a great moment early on in the musical Hamilton. If you've seen it, I'm sure you know. It's Farmer Refuted is the song. And it's a great sort of coupling of two types of pamphlets you would see, because there was propaganda on both sides. You had revolutionary propaganda like Common Sense. Another one was, Hamilton wrote a couple of these pamphlets. much less well known. Hamilton's much better known for the Federalist Papers and writings that come later. Paine never really stayed comfortable. As soon as the revolution is done, Paine leaves America and he goes to France and he takes part in their revolution. He actually gets locked up in the Reign of Terror and nearly was executed by guillotine. He was saved through a sort of a clerical error. The jailer that was supposed to indicate when the jailer was trying to indicate that you were set for execution, they would take like a piece of chalk and write on the panel on the outside of your prison cell door. And the guy who did it actually wrote it on the inside of the door and then closed it so the executioner walked through and didn't see the chalk mark. So Paine survives. But he would die penniless and broken and without any friends. It's a very sad thing, but when Paine was locked up for nearly a year in France, he wrote a couple of very interesting books. The first of which was a defense of the French Revolution. It's called The Rights of Man. It's a wonderful piece of political literature. Very, very good. Still read in colleges today. The second one, less well known, and it got him into a lot of trouble. It was called The Age of Reason. The Age of Reason is about 100-page pamphlet blasting religion, where Paine basically said, religion is the silliest, stupidest thing I ever heard of. The Bible's a bunch of myths, and let me prove it. And he literally goes book by book in the Bible, ridiculing it, making fun of it, and saying it's just all silly. Now, a lot of the founding fathers agreed with him. Jefferson was one of them, who actually, you would call him a deist at the time, about as close to an atheist as you could be today. And basically Jefferson's attitude was, hey, we all agree with you, but don't say it out loud, fool. We have to talk to the farmers to get elected, and they think that we believe in all of this stuff, so just be quiet about it. So everyone just pretended they didn't know him anymore. Eventually, he'll leave France. He gets, released. He'll try to go back to England. He tries to write, and then he takes to the bottle and he basically drinks himself to death. It's a pretty sad story, but Thomas Paine forever deserves a place in every American's heart for common sense. And then, incredibly, he joins the army after he writes Common Sense. He enlists and he fights. So you might have heard the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. Thomas Paine used both. He wrote propaganda for the revolution, and then he actually put his body on the line and fought. Then he took part in the French Revolution. Pretty cool guy. All right, at the bottom here, we have France agrees to supply the colonies with supplies. A huge turning point in the revolution is the Battle of Saratoga. For over a year, the Congress was begging Louis XVI, because France was it certainly was more populous. It was about 3 times the size as Great Britain. Great Britain's about 7 million people. Colonies are about 2 million. France is about 20 million at this time. Richer and more powerful. It just doesn't have the Navy and therefore lost the 7 Years' War. But we need their help. And the idea is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Let's reach out to them. Why not? Well, Louis wasn't sure how serious we were. His biggest fear is that he would join us in a war against England, and then we would betray him and make peace, and he would be left out on a limb fighting this war on his own. He looked at a couple of these early battles and he said, okay, interesting, maybe I'll help you. What really changes his mind is the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is fought in October of 1777, way up in northern New York. And all you really need to know is Johnny Burgoyne, who was coming from Canada, marching down the Hudson, trying to cut New England in two so that he could, stop all retreats northward, might have succeeded had he done it, but he was ambushed by rebels, captured thousands of British redcoats. It was a humiliating defeat for the British, and it was evidence to the French that they would now put their lives on the line. It pains me to say it, and I have to say it every year, we could not have done this without the French. And we forget this, and we often, look down our noses at the French. Early in the lecture, I said, oh, they don't fight very well. We bailed them out in 2 world wars. We would not exist as the United States of America were it not for the French. And that's a painful truth, but it is the truth. We did not have the banking system to supply this. We didn't have the weapons. We didn't have anything. The British are basically blockading the entire eastern coast, so we had no control over any of our ports. We couldn't get goods in and out of the country unless the French Navy came and sort of chased them away, which they would. So Louis not only loans us all kinds of money and gives us weapons, he loans us a couple of generals. He loans us the Marquis de Lafayette, a 19-year-old nobleman who had been to the best military academies in France. And all due respect to George Washington, he wasn't the best tactician necessarily. He hadn't been to these great universities. Believe it or not, folks, he went 3-6 in the Revolution. He fought 9 battles, won 3 and lost 6. He wins the war, though, because he was never captured and he kept the army together. Notice the dynamics here. Britain, in order to win the war, has to send its army across the ocean, chase down and defeat the rebel army, and hold all the territory. All the rebels have to do is just not lose. From the outset, after declaring independence in 1776, the rebels controlled every single colonial government. And so they just have to not lose and not get captured. And Washington did that, but Lafayette gave him a very quick education on how to fight these battles, basically. The other one was a general named Rochambeau. And also we were given an admiral, Admiral de Grasse, who essentially sent his fleet to the eastern seaboard of America to chase away the redcoats every couple of months so that weapons and money could be smuggled in, and they were our lifeline. Now, what we don't want is French troops, because our biggest fear was, well, that would be even worse, right? The British army would leave, and then this French Catholic army would be in control of us. We don't want that. We made it very plain to Louis. We do not want, you're not going to get any land out of this. Now, if you manage to capture something in the Caribbean or India or England itself, hey, you can keep it. But Canada, the West, and all of North America, that belongs to us. The French were good at their word, believe it or not. Okay, I realize now I kind of skipped over the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson obviously writes this. He was commissioned to write it with Adams and with Franklin, and they deferred to Jefferson because he was the best writer of the three. It's a beautiful piece of political prose. I highly recommend that you all read it. It was an explanation of what this revolution was all about, essentially, if you read it. And the part that nobody reads, the latter part of it, is a laundry list of all the violations. He basically says in it that revolutions are not taken up lightly. I'm paraphrasing. But there sometimes comes a time when an oppressive authority just continuously abuses people, and they need to dissolve that connection with that oppressive government and set up one of their own. And basically he cites John Locke, that there is a right to revolution, that governments are instituted to protect the rights of human beings, men, he would say at the time. And if the government is abusive of that continuously, you reach a breaking point and you can revolt. And then he catalogs all the bad things that George III did. And it's beautiful prose in the beginning, and it's a great, wonderful document. I highly encourage you all to read it. Jefferson's a great character in the Hamilton musical. Check it out. Okay, we're not going to do Yorktown, but that's the last battle of the Revolution. Notice we're short on military history. It's really irrelevant. It's not on the AP test. You need to know why there was a revolution, political developments, and then aftermath. So let's talk about the aftermath of all of this. So, to the Native Americans, the war was devastating. It was the worst possible outcome that could happen. 2 tribes were happy, the Oneidas and Tuscaroras, but after a couple of years, they would be betrayed and they would, feel terrible too. Slaves. Well, this is two-sided. Slaves in the North, in New England, are all freed as a result of the Revolution. Every one of those governments after 1776 said, our government is signed on to the Declaration. We're not a colony in the British Empire anymore. We are now an independent state. And so they wrote state constitution. Even before they had a national constitution, they all wrote state constitutions. And all of the northeastern states write constitutions that abolish slavery. All of them south of the Mason-Dixon line, so Delaware, Maryland, and all the rest down to Georgia, they all keep slavery. So slaves in the North were freed because of the Revolution. Slaves in the South were kept in slavery because of the Revolution. So it's a very weird dynamic there. What about the Tories? What about the people that bet on the wrong horse, so to speak? It's estimated about 1/3 of all colonists remained loyal to the British Crown. These people were typically Anglican clergy that had, arrived in the colonies relatively recently, colonial officials, judges, people like that, recent immigrants. And they were not treated very well. The peace treaty of 1783 said that these people would be undisturbed, they could keep their land. Most of them are chased out of the country. Their property is taken from them. Most of them flee to Canada or back to Great Britain, and this will be a sticking point between us and Britain for another decade. We then write our first national constitution. Most Americans do not know this at all. We had our first constitution before the one we're operating under right now. This is what I call Constitution 1.0. The one we have right now is really the second one. If you guys don't know, most countries label what constitution they are by naming it their republic, right? So like France right now is on their 5th republic. The French love to have revolutions, right? Their first republic is 1789. They write a constitution. They write another one in 1830, another one in 1848, another one in 1871. And then they wrote their last one in 1958. So their constitution that they're operating under right now is pretty new. Our first one is finished in 1781, and it was a complete and total disaster. Essentially, there's a weak central government in New York that controls almost nothing. Each state was a government unto itself. So basically, we went from 13 colonies to 13 independent states with a very weak government. In fact, the Continental Army is disbanded. This was probably a good idea because most revolutions end with the threat of a coup, but Washington, okay, we can criticize him for being a slave owner and all of the faults that he had with that, but I will sing his praises on this issue. He was no Napoleon or Julius Caesar. Usually when there's a revolution in a country, the head general demands some kind of political power afterwards. Washington did not. He turned his sword over to the Congress and said, "Thank you for my commission. I'm going home now." And he went home. And he thought, my political career is done. I'm not going to do anything anymore. I'm going home to my wife. I miss Martha. He would then be begged to come out of retirement later to be president, but he did not seek it at all. But the national government for those first few years afterwards was just atrocious. The biggest problem of all is debt. The national government had borrowed so heavily to fund this war, we could not pay off our debts to the French or to the Dutch or to the Spanish. We could not pay off the debts to all of the citizens and bankers who funded this war because the national government had no mechanism to tax. They had a Congress that could pass laws, but there was no IRS that would go out and actually collect taxes. Because the same reason we disbanded the army, people were terrified that this revolution would be over before it began if the federal government was too strong. The men of our revolution studied past revolutions and they found out that this is how they usually end. And they often end up worse than it was before because that central authority is too strong. So the army is disbanded and we create 13 separate armies. Every state had its own army. And there was no federal agencies or federal courts. There was no president. There was just a Congress that passed laws and everybody ignored it. Technically, the states were supposed to enforce these laws, but they never did. And so states printed money, okay? You had 16 different currencies circulating through the colonies in the 1780s. Each state had its own dollar. And then there were national dollars that the Congress printed. And then there was European money. Some people still use the British pound. So even though we had political independence from Britain, economically, most people are still using their currencies. People use French francs, people used Spanish doubloons, people used Dutch guilders, people were using all kinds of different currencies, which was a nightmare for trade. Hamilton is one of these guys who's involved in banking and trade, and he says this is a nightmare, and we'll never be able to grow into a wealthy, prosperous country with 16 different currencies. We need one government to establish one currency and one uniform rule for trade. A lot of states would block trade from other states, right? Connecticut said, Massachusetts, you can't sell your goods in our state. And then Massachusetts would say, okay, you can't sell your goods in our state. You need freedom of trade so that everyone can prosper in a good economy. And that was just impossible. States printed their own money, so it devalued the currency. It created a hyperinflation. Men were promised a pension when they signed up for the army in the 1770s, and that pension never came. They were made all these promises. You're going to get land in the West. You're going to be paid this huge sum. Then the war ended and the Congress said, well, we can't really raise this money because we have no agency to do it. Apply to your state and your state will give you something. A lot of states like Rhode Island, we don't have any land to give. We have a tiny state. it was just a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. Probably one of the biggest problems of all was the West. Nobody knew what the West was. Now, under the Treaty of 1783, we get every possible thing we could ever want. We get independence for the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard, now the United States of America, 13 states. But also, we gain all of the land up to the Mississippi River. Now, Native Americans in the hundreds of thousands lived here, but the United States believes we control this land. So basically, the size of the country doubled overnight. It was this right here, and then it expanded to include this territory here. But legally, what is it? Some people thought, well, we'll just take these states that border the West and their borders will go all the way to the Mississippi River. So like Pennsylvania would start off like this, but now that it won the war, Pennsylvania would include all of this territory as well. They ran into a problem where Virginia claimed that land too. And this little strip of land here, I love this. Connecticut, little Connecticut over here, which does not even border the West, is sending its militia through these other states and claiming land into what's today Ohio. And believe it or not, the states are squaring off against each other and nearly went to war. New York and New Hampshire very nearly went to war over Vermont. Vermont was not its own state at this point. And they had old colonial charters from the 1600s where it wasn't clear exactly where the border was. So New York and New Hampshire both sent their armies into this territory, and there was nearly a civil war. And finally, the Congress had to create the state of Vermont to kind of create a buffer zone there between the two. And the biggest problem of all was all this land in the West. It was a blessing and a curse. Here's how it was solved, and you got to give it to Thomas Jefferson. What he said was, the land in the West is territories. It's not a state, okay, because states will get votes and representation, but they are territories. They will be governed directly by the federal government. All citizens in the United States can travel there and take land there. And it will operate under this legal scheme for a certain period, a tutorial period, where population will have to grow. They'll have to, govern themselves for a while. Once they reach 70,000 citizens, 70,000 because that was the smallest state at the time, Delaware, then they could apply for admission to the Union, and if Congress agreed, they would be a co-equal state. This is the process by which all the other states were added to the Union, steadily moving west, conquering the entire continent. The only exception here would be Texas, which is added in a weird way. We'll talk about it later. It was never added as a state. It was an independent republic, its own country, and we annexed it voluntarily. And we'll talk about that later. But the rest of them became territories that we acquired either through war or through purchase. And then they were sort of tutored into a state, except for the handful of territories that we still have. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands. I'm probably forgetting a few. Samoa. Okay, but you guys all know that, I'm sure. So Jefferson solved this great issue, right? The problem of the West. He wrote this law. It's now territories. A companion piece to the Land Ordinance of 1785 is the Northwest Ordinance of that same year. Interestingly enough, the slave owner Jefferson from Virginia wrote a law that said that the territory north of the Ohio River, so that will be today, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, will be forever free. Slavery shall not take root there, which was incredible that even Southerners agreed to that Northwest territory would be free. Unfortunately, the Southwestern territories, once those areas are acquired, slavery will indeed spread there, and those states will balance out and be co-equal with the free states. So we've got the good and we've got the bad together. Let's talk a little bit about the state governments that are set up. State constitutions, you get a wide array. You get 13 different ones. Some of them are incredibly liberal, like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania developed a unicameral legislature, which meant only a House of Representatives of Pennsylvania. They had no state senate. They also had no governor, and they dropped the property qualification for voting. Excuse me. Now, this is not as good as our standards today, but we have to judge it on the standards of the time, meaning in Pennsylvania, voting requirement was any adult free white man. And that was a huge step forward because prior to the revolution, you had to own land, substantial amounts of land in order to vote. Now, There were men like William Finley who came to Pennsylvania in the 1750s as an indentured servant, and he died as a representative of the US government from Pennsylvania. Because he fought in the Revolution, he gained his freedom, although he didn't have land, he was self-educated, ran for office, and had this wonderful career. Now again, African Americans not given the right to vote, Native Americans not given the right to vote, women not given the right to vote. By our own standards of today, it's terrible, but one has to judge it on Europe and what America was at the time, and that was a huge step forward. Other states are a bit stricter, but they'll all be much more liberal or more progressive than they were under the monarchy. No more royal governors. Okay, governors will be either elected by the people or chosen by the legislature of the state. So this is an interesting experiment, but it very nearly was going to degenerate into anarchy over all kinds of fights, over all kinds of stuff. The last issue that really drives people crazy is Shays' Rebellion, which is right here, 1786. So here's what happened. Rhode Island, probably the most radical of all states at the time, right here, they passed a series of really interesting debt relief laws that really angered people in other states. So here's what happened. Lots of men in Rhode Island went and borrowed money from banks in New York and Connecticut, and then they took that money and they built up businesses and bought farms and stuff in Rhode Island. Now, under the law, you could actually pay back that loan with your Rhode Island dollars. Rhode Island then went and just printed out a bunch of money and just gave it to their citizens. Why would they do something so radical? Because Rhode Island had very progressive laws on who could vote. Just about anybody could vote, even illiterate, ignorant, uneducated men. Even if you didn't own land, you could vote. And so they passed these laws that benefited them. So many young men served in the war, and because they didn't get a paycheck for 5 or 6 years, they went home to their farm after the war and they had defaulted. Their family couldn't make the payments while they were gone. The British came through and burned down their home, whatever. And a lot of people said, here's how I'll get out of this debt. We'll just print out a bunch of money and I'll pay off these banks to New York. Men like Hamilton thought, this is just insanity. This is crazy. In Massachusetts, they wouldn't let landless white men vote to change the law. So Shays' Rebellion was the solution for them. So here's what happens here. Daniel Shays, a very poor farmer, lost his farm. It was foreclosed upon, and he feels betrayed because he was promised. He was a hero. He served in the Revolution. He was promised money and a farm. He never got it. And so he and his buddies are at a tavern, and they're sort of commiserating on all of this, and they just feel betrayed. They just feel that we've swapped one tyrant for another. It used to be that the king controlled us and, and abused us here in Massachusetts. Well, now we would like to change things, and we would like to have our own revolution here in Massachusetts to overthrow the dictators, and we're going to distribute land and everything to the poor. And so Daniel Shays took his musket. He got together with his friends who all similarly had their farms foreclosed upon, and then they marched on the courthouse in Western Massachusetts, arrested the judges there, and then closed down the courts, basically arguing, well, if the courts aren't in operation, they can't foreclose on anyone's farms and give it back to the banks. This was sort of, populism at its extreme. And like the French Revolution, our revolution unleashed this sort of insatiable lust for violence and overthrowing the man, so to speak. Our founding fathers felt that this was the worst thing ever. This is the tipping point, 1786 Shays' Rebellion. This is when the letters start to fly. Washington writes to Adams, Adams writes to Jefferson, Jefferson writes to Hamilton, Hamilton writes to Madison, and no one was more angry than Hamilton about this because he was one of these bankers who was loaning out money to other states, and they effectively wiped out the debt, paying him back with worthless Rhode Island dollars. And he just said, we need one currency, no manipulation of states. He just thought it was immoral to borrow money and not pay it back. Like these men just wanted to go around the law. You have to respect the law. Well, these men had just fought in a revolution and they thought you could use violence if you were getting screwed over. So why not? So it's a fascinating discussion. Is Daniel Shays a hero and he's sort of trying to bring to fruition a full revolution? Or was he just a criminal who was trying to, look out for himself? I don't know. but it's why the Constitution was written. The letters fly, and the letters end up being invitations for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787, the next year, which we'll get to next time. I have talked way too long, but I love the Revolution. It's one of my absolute favorite topics. So thanks, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hey, smash that subscribe button so I can get a lot of subscribers. That way I can retire, right? Just joking. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Answer the questions. See you next time.